I never thought I'd be the one to walk away from my family. Growing up, I always pictured myself as the loyal son, the one who'd stick around, help out when needed, and be there for my parents no matter what. But life has a funny way of showing you people's true colors, especially when money is involved. My name is Ethan Carter, and I have a twin brother, Ryan. From the moment we could walk, there was always a difference in how we were treated. Ryan was the golden child, athletic, charming, the kind of guy who could trip over his own feet and somehow still land on his feet with a smile. Me? I was the quiet one. Books over sports. Computers over parties. Not that I ever resented him for it, but I always knew, deep down, that between the two of us, he was the favorite. Still, I never imagined things would spiral like this. We both graduated from UCLA on the same day, a proud moment for the family, or at least it should have been. Ryan had taken the traditional route, studying business. I, on the other hand, had been freelancing online since I was 16, teaching myself how to code, investing early, and saving every cent. By the time we graduated, I wasn't rich, but I had built something for myself, a foundation. The day after graduation, our parents threw Ryan a surprise. I still remember the look on his face when Dad pulled the keys from his pocket. A sleek, jet-black BMW 5 Series sat in the driveway, glistening in the California sun. Ryan hollered like he'd just won the lottery, hugging Mom and Dad as if they had personally handed him the keys to a kingdom. I watched from the porch, waiting. Maybe they had something for me too. A watch? A letter? A simple, "We're proud of you," would have been nice. Instead, my father walked up to me and handed me an envelope. I knew something was wrong the moment I felt the weight of it. It wasn't a gift. It was a bill. "What is this?" I asked, opening it. A long list of numbers stared back at me. Tuition payments, household expenses, loans. The final total made my stomach turn. My mother smiled, as if she'd just given me the best present in the world. "It's only fair, Ethan. You've been working for years, you've saved up so much. It's time for you to help out the family." Dad nodded, as if this was the most reasonable thing in the world. "Ryan doesn't have savings yet. He needs a fresh start. But you're responsible. This is just a small way you can contribute." I felt the air leave my lungs. They weren't giving me a gift. They were handing me their debt. I looked at Ryan, expecting, hoping for some kind of reaction. Maybe guilt. Maybe a simple, "Hey, this isn't right." But he just shrugged. "Come on, man. You always say money doesn't matter." And that's when I made my decision. I took a deep breath, folded the paper neatly, and slid it back into the envelope. "Thank you," I said, my voice even. "This is a real eye-opener." My mother beamed, thinking I had agreed. I smiled back. Then I packed my bags and left. No yelling, no arguing, no dramatics, just a quiet, calculated exit. They didn't try to stop me. Maybe they didn't fully realize what I was doing. Not yet anyway. But that would change soon enough. Because 2 weeks later, the calls started. At first, I ignored them. My voicemail filled up with messages from my parents, my brother, even my aunt. The first few were casual. "Hey, Ethan, just checking in. Call us back." Then they grew more insistent. "Ethan, why aren't you answering? We need to talk." And then came the desperation. "Please, Ethan, we didn't mean it like that. Just call us back." I didn't. For the first time in my life, I was putting myself first. I rented a cheap Airbnb in Phoenix, just far enough from Los Angeles to breathe, but close enough to remind myself I hadn't entirely disappeared. I didn't know what I wanted to do next, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going back. My parents, though? They weren't as lucky. The second week, Ryan started calling. At first, it was all bravado. "Dude, stop being dramatic. Just come back already." I blocked his number. Then Mom switched tactics. "Ethan, sweetheart, we're struggling. You know we've always supported you. Can't you just help us out a little?" That was rich, coming from the woman who had smiled as she handed me a bill instead of a congratulations. Then the real panic set in. One evening, as I was checking my email, a message popped up from my dad. Subject: "Please read this." I hesitated, then clicked. "Ethan, we're in trouble. We took out some loans we can't pay back. We thought we could handle it, but things are getting worse. Ryan doesn't have the means to help us, and we thought, you've always been so independent, so responsible, we thought you wouldn't mind. We misjudged the situation, and for that, I'm sorry. But we need you. Please, at least call us back. I stared at the screen for a long time. It was the closest thing to an admission of guilt I had ever gotten from my father. But it wasn't really an apology, was it? They weren't sorry for how they treated me. They were sorry that I had left, and now their golden child wasn't enough to fix their problems. I closed the email without responding. A few days later, another call came in, this time from my Aunt Linda. I hesitated before answering. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft, almost pleading. "Can we talk?" I sighed. "About what?" "Your parents. They're worried about you." I laughed bitterly. "Yeah, I'm sure they are. But I think they're a little more worried about themselves right now." A long pause. Then, finally, she spoke. "Please, don't be like this. They made a mistake. They thought you'd understand." I clenched my jaw. "Linda, answer me this. If they're struggling so badly, how did they afford that BMW?" Silence. Then she exhaled. "I don't know, Ethan. They thought they could handle it. They wanted Ryan to have something special. They never imagined you'd leave over it." I felt a pang of something, anger, maybe frustration, a bitterness that wouldn't fade. "And what about me? What did I get for graduating?" I said, my voice hard. "A bill." "They didn't know how to show you they were proud," she whispered. "But Ethan, I think they finally realized they messed up. They just don't know how to fix it." I let her words sit for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure if I even wanted them to fix it. And the next call I received would make that decision for me. The days that followed were eerily silent. I expected more calls, more messages, more guilt-tripping, but instead I got quiet. It was almost unsettling, like the calm before a storm. For a moment, I thought maybe they had given up. Maybe they had accepted that I wasn't their safety net anymore. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't over. It was on a Wednesday night that my prediction came true. My phone buzzed with an unknown number. I hesitated, debating whether I should even answer. My gut told me to ignore it, but curiosity won out. "Ethan," a familiar voice said the moment I picked up. My grip on the phone tightened. It was Ryan. "Why are you calling me?" I asked, keeping my voice even. He exhaled sharply. "Because things are getting bad, man. I didn't realize how much of a mess they were in." I stayed silent, letting him talk. "They had to sell the car," he admitted, his voice unsteady. "The BMW? It's gone?" A twisted part of me wanted to laugh. After everything, after all the sacrifices they had demanded from me, their prized possession was the first to go. I should have felt bad, but I didn't. "They should have thought about that before they spent money they didn't have," I replied coldly. Ryan let out a humorless chuckle. "Yeah, no kidding. He stopped, hesitating. "They got mixed up with the wrong people, Ethan. Some of these loans aren't normal." I frowned. "What the hell does that mean?" "I mean, they didn't just borrow from a bank. They owe money to people who don't take kindly to late payments." The air in my lungs turned to ice. I had walked away from my parents expecting them to deal with the fallout of their own poor choices. But this was something else. "How bad is it?" I asked. Ryan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Bad enough that I'm scared for them." I clenched my jaw. This wasn't my problem anymore. They had made their choices. But something about the way Ryan said it made me pause. "They asked you to call me, didn't they?" I finally said. He didn't answer right away. "They didn't have to," he admitted. "I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, but Ethan, I need your help. Not for them. For me." For the first time in years, there was no smugness in his voice. No arrogance. Just desperation. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I'll think about it." And for the first time since I left, I wasn't sure if I meant it. I spent the next 3 days in a battle with myself. Walking away from my family had been the right decision, but now there was a new variable in the equation: danger. Real physical danger. And as much as I wanted to stay out of it, I couldn't ignore the sick feeling that curled in my gut every time I thought about it. The night before I made my decision, I sat in my dingy Airbnb, staring at my laptop screen, looking for flights back to Los Angeles. I had promised myself I wouldn't go back. That was the whole point of leaving. But what if I wasn't going back for them? What if I was going back for myself? To make sure that whatever storm they had summoned wasn't going to drag me down with them. By morning, I was on a plane. Los Angeles smelled the same. Ocean salt, car exhaust, and desperation. I stepped out of the terminal, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder, and hailed a cab. The driver barely glanced at me as I got in. "Where to?" he asked, voice rough from too many cigarettes. I hesitated. Then I gave him an address I never thought I'd use again. My parents' house. The drive felt surreal. Everything looked the same, but it wasn't. Not to me. Every street, every sign, every familiar landmark reminded me of what I had walked away from. And now, like some tragic fool, I was heading straight back into it. When the cab pulled up, I didn't get out right away. The house looked smaller somehow, like it had shrunk under the weight of its own bad decisions. The once pristine lawn was overgrown, the porch light flickering weakly. I had a sinking feeling this wasn't just a financial crisis. It was a full collapse. I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. Footsteps. Then the door opened, and there stood my father. He looked like hell. His once neatly combed hair was disheveled, his face thinner than I remembered. His eyes widened when he saw me, as if he thought I was some kind of hallucination. "Ethan," he breathed. "You came?" I crossed my arms. "Not for a family reunion. Tell me what's going on." He swallowed hard and stepped aside. "You should come in." I didn't want to, but I did. Inside, the house was a mess. Stacks of unopened mail covered the dining table. Empty liquor bottles sat on the counter. The air smelled like stale coffee and stress. My mother sat in the living room, her face pale, eyes sunken. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice cracking. "Oh, thank God." "Cut the dramatics," I snapped. "Tell me everything. Now." Ryan appeared from the hallway, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's worse than we thought," he muttered. "The people they owe money to? They're not playing around." "How much?" I asked, my voice ice cold. Dad hesitated. 100,000. I nearly laughed. "Jesus Christ, Dad. And they want it now," Ryan added. Or else. The weight of those words settled in my chest like a stone. I exhaled sharply. "You better start explaining." The next hour was spent unraveling a financial disaster so mind-bogglingly stupid, I had to stop myself from punching a wall. My parents had taken out loans from some shady lender, someone who didn't operate with contracts and interest rates, but with threats and consequences. They had used the money to maintain appearances, to make sure Ryan got his fresh start. And now, the wolves were at the door. "I don't have that kind of money," I said when they finished their sob story. "Even if I did, I wouldn't hand it over." Dad sighed. "We don't expect you to pay it all. We just need help finding a way out." Ryan cleared his throat. "There's a meeting tonight." With them, my eyes snapped to his. "You're telling me you set up a meeting with the people threatening you?" "They said it was non-negotiable." I ran a hand down my face. This was getting worse by the second. "Fine," I said. "I'll go. But don't expect me to play hero." The meeting was set for 9 p.m. at an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. Classic intimidation tactic. Take them somewhere isolated, make them feel small. But I wasn't some wide-eyed idiot walking into the lion's den unarmed. I had a plan. Before we left, I made a call to an old contact. Someone who knew the game better than I did. Someone who owed me a favor. When we arrived at the warehouse, the tension was thick enough to choke on. 3 men stood waiting. The one in the middle, clearly the boss, was a thick-set guy with cold, calculating eyes. He smiled when he saw my father. "Mr. Carter," he said smoothly. "I was starting to think you'd run." Dad swallowed hard. "We're here? Aren't we?" The man's gaze flicked to me. "And you are?" "Ethan." I kept my posture relaxed but firm. "I'm here to talk." His smile widened. "Talk? There's nothing to talk about. There's only payment." I tilted my head. "See, that's where you're wrong." His amusement faltered. "Excuse me? You deal in leverage, right?" I said, stepping closer. "You make sure people owe you, control them, keep them on a leash. But there's a flaw in your system." He frowned. "And what's that?" I smiled. "People like me?" Right on cue. The warehouse doors swung open behind us. 2 men stepped in, my contact and his associate. These weren't small-time enforcers. These were the kind of people that even loan sharks didn't want to mess with. The boss stiffened, his men shifting uncomfortably. "You were saying?" I asked. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, with a sharp nod, the boss exhaled. "Fine. 50,000. Final offer. I smirked. 10. And you never come near my family again. His eyes darkened. That's not how this works. It is tonight. Silence. Then, finally, he nodded once. Deal? Relief washed through me, but I didn't show it. We shook hands like businessmen, though we both knew this was anything but a professional arrangement. As we left the warehouse, Ryan looked at me, wide-eyed. How the hell did you do that? I shrugged. You don't survive in this world without knowing a few people. My father was silent, my mother on the verge of tears. I had just saved them, and yet I felt nothing. Because I knew one thing for certain, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The deal should have ended that night. 10 grand, a handshake, and a warning to never come near my family again. But the thing about people like them, they never let go that easily. I should have seen it coming. 3 days after the warehouse meeting, I was back in my temporary rental, trying to convince myself that I could disappear again. That whatever lingering guilt I felt for saving my family wasn't a reason to stay. Then, at exactly 2:37 a.m., my phone rang. Ryan. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. But something told me this wasn't one of his usual panic pleas. I answered. They took Dad. His voice was raw, breathless, like he had been running. They just grabbed him. Middle of the night. Mom's losing her mind. I shot out of bed, already pulling on a jacket. Slow down. Who took him? The guys from the warehouse. They didn't honor the deal. Of course they didn't. Where are you now? I demanded, grabbing my keys. At Mom's. They left a message. Said we had 12 hours to fix our unfinished business. I clenched my teeth. All right. Sit tight. I'll handle it. Ethan. I hung up. I didn't call the cops. The cops wouldn't help. They'd take a report, tell us to wait, and by then, Dad would either be missing for good or found in pieces somewhere no one would look twice. So I went to the only person I knew could help me. Hunter. Hunter owed me a favor. A big one. The kind of favor that gets called in when there's no other option. I drove to the bar where he worked, a rundown joint in East LA that smelled like cigarette smoke and regret. He was behind the counter, drying a glass when I walked in. You look like hell, he said without looking up. Good. I need a favor. He set the glass down. This the kind that gets people killed? Depends. That made him smirk. All right, I'm listening. I told him everything about the money, the loan sharks, the deal that had gone bad. When I finished, he let out a long breath, rubbing a hand over his face. You really know how to find trouble, he muttered. Then he reached behind the bar, pulled out a duffel bag, and tossed it to me. I caught it and unzipped it. Inside were 2 handguns, extra clips, and a combat knife. My stomach turned. You always keep this lying around? Only when I know you're coming. I shook my head. I just need information. Where are they keeping my dad? Hunter leaned against the bar. You're lucky. I know a guy who works for them. If they're holding him somewhere, he'll know. Call him. Hunter's contact took an hour to find, but when he finally called back, the answer was worse than I expected. They've got him at the docks, Hunter relayed. Old warehouse on Pier 17. If he's still breathing, that's where he'll be. I exhaled sharply. Then we go now? Hunter arched a brow. You sure you want to do this? No, I admitted, but I don't have a choice. The docks were quiet when we arrived, the air thick with the smell of salt and rust. Hunter and I moved in the shadows, keeping low as we approached the warehouse. A single light flickered above the entrance, casting long, eerie shadows. There, Hunter whispered, pointing to 2 men standing guard outside. Armed? I nodded, my pulse steady. We do this clean? No noise. Hunter grinned. I like the way you think. We moved fast. Before the first guy even registered our presence, Hunter had him in a chokehold, dragging him into the darkness. I took the second one, striking hard and fast, knocking him out cold before he could even reach for his gun. We stepped over their unconscious bodies and slipped inside. The warehouse was bigger than I expected. Rows of rusted shipping containers stacked against the walls, the floor covered in grime and oil stains. And there, tied to a chair in the center of the room, was my father. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut. But he was alive. I exhaled. One problem down. Then came another one. Look what we have here. I turned slowly. The boss from the warehouse stepped out of the shadows, flanked by 3 men. All armed. All ready. I clenched my jaw. Let him go? The boss smirked. That's not how this works, kid. You thought you could walk away after a measly 10 grand? That was just a down payment. I took a step closer. You're making a mistake? He raised a gun, pointing it directly at my chest. No, Ethan. You did. The next few seconds happened in a blur. Hunter moved first. A single gunshot echoed in the warehouse, and the man closest to him dropped. Chaos erupted. I lunged for cover as bullets tore through the air, metal clanging against metal. My heart pounded, adrenaline surging through my veins. I peeked over the crate I had ducked behind. 2 men were still standing. The boss and one of his guys. Hunter had already taken out the third. I didn't think. I moved. I rolled out from cover, raised my gun, and fired. The second guy crumpled. The boss turned his weapon on me, but before he could pull the trigger, Hunter was there, knocking the gun from his hands and slamming him to the ground. Silence followed. Heavy. Tense. I stood, catching my breath, then walked over to the boss, who was groaning in pain beneath Hunter's boot. I crouched down. Let me make something clear. You ever come near my family again, I won't just take your money. I pressed the barrel of my gun to his forehead. I'll take everything. His face twisted in rage, but he said nothing. Get up, I ordered. He did. Now walk. We forced him out of the warehouse, down to the end of the dock, where the water lapped hungrily against the wooden beams. Swim, I said. He glared at me. You serious? I cocked my head. Dead serious. Hunter shoved him forward. He hit the water with a splash, sputtering and cursing as the current dragged him out. I turned back to my father, cutting the ropes around his wrists. He looked up at me, eyes heavy with something I couldn't place. Ethan, I shook my head. Don't. Just don't. He nodded slowly, rubbing his wrists. Let's go home. I hesitated, looking out at the water where the boss had vanished into the night. Then I exhaled and turned away. Yeah, I murmured. Let's go. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew this wasn't over. I should have known it wouldn't be over. Even as we walked away from the warehouse, leaving the boss to struggle against the tide, I could feel it in my bones. There was unfinished business. Something about the way he had glared at me, even soaked and defeated, told me that a man like him didn't forgive. He didn't forget, and neither did I. 2 weeks passed in a strange kind of limbo. I had stayed in town longer than I meant to, watching over my family from the shadows, ensuring that the debt collectors really did disappear. Ryan and my mother were relieved, but my father? He wasn't the same. He wasn't grateful. He was humiliated. One night, as I sat in my rental with a bottle of cheap whiskey, my phone rang. I expected Ryan, maybe even my mother, but the name that popped up on my screen made my stomach drop. Hunter. I picked up. What? Ethan, he said, his voice low, urgent. You need to leave. I sat up straighter. Why? They're coming. My grip tightened around the glass. Who? Boss survived, he said. And he's not happy. He wants payback. Real payback. I just heard from one of my contacts. He's putting a bounty on you. My blood ran cold. How much? Hunter exhaled. 50 grand. I let out a bitter laugh. That's all I'm worth? Ethan, listen to me, Hunter said, his voice cutting through my sarcasm. He's not playing games. You have maybe 12 hours before people start showing up at your door. I nodded to myself. Already moving, already packing. Thanks, Hunter. I mean it, man, he said. Get out of town, and don't come back. I ended the call. Then I reached under the bed, grabbed the duffel bag Hunter had given me before, and started loading it. I wasn't just running. I was preparing for war. I didn't go to the airport. That's where they'd expect me to be. Instead, I took back roads, moving fast but careful, checking my mirrors, watching for tails. I had been through enough to know that when someone puts a price on your head, there are plenty of desperate people willing to collect. By the time I reached the city outskirts, I had a plan. Disappear. Change my name. Maybe head south, cross the border, find a new life. But part of me, the part that had been hardened by years of neglect and betrayal, refused to run. I pulled into an abandoned lot and cut the engine. My pulse was steady. My mind was clear. If they wanted me, they were going to have to earn it. The first car showed up just after midnight. A black sedan, creeping through the lot with its headlights off. Amateur move. I was already waiting. The moment they stepped out, 3 men, each armed, I fired the first shot. The silence of the night shattered as one of them dropped, clutching his leg. The other 2 dove for cover. I moved fast, keeping low, circling them. They were sloppy, untrained, probably some low-level thugs looking for a quick payout. I didn't give them a chance to rethink their choices. When the dust settled, the car was still running. 2 men were unconscious, and the third, he was crawling, bleeding, gasping. I crouched beside him, pressing my gun against his temple. "Where is he?" The man groaned. "Oh, the boss." He hesitated, and I pressed harder. "Where?" "The docks," he wheezed. "Warehouse, 23. I stood up. "Thanks." Then I knocked him out cold. It had come full circle. The same docks. The same stormy night. But this time, I wasn't walking in unprepared. I parked a block away and made my way through the shadows, checking my weapon, keeping my steps light. When I reached the warehouse, I counted 6 men inside, all armed. The boss was there too, sitting in a chair like he owned the world. He was waiting for me. I didn't keep him waiting long. The first guard dropped with a silent shot. The second barely had time to turn before I was on him, a knife flashing in the dim light. I moved through the warehouse like a ghost, methodical, precise, erasing them one by one. By the time I reached the boss, he was alone. He looked up at me, his face twisted in fury. "You think this ends with me?" I cocked my head. "No," I admitted. "But you do." I pulled the trigger. He slumped forward, blood pooling beneath him. And just like that, it was done. By sunrise, I was gone. No goodbyes. No explanations. My family would be safe now, but that didn't mean I could ever go back. The world I had stepped into wouldn't just let me walk away. There would always be someone else, some other threat. But I wasn't afraid, because now, I knew exactly what I was capable of. And if anyone came looking for me again, they wouldn't live long enough to regret it.